When I saw her seated there, smiling like she owned the room, I felt a strange cold knot form in my stomach. She didn't just look comfortable, she looked entitled, as if the life that belonged to my family had somehow already slipped through my fingers. That was the day I realized my husband's past had teeth I hadn't accounted for, and I wasn't ready for the bite. I remember the smell of freshly brewed coffee as I sat across from her, my hands wrapped tightly around the cup, trying to ground myself. Her laugh, light, calculated, echoed in the small room, bouncing off the walls of my late father-in-law's study. She wore the kind of silk blouse that catches light just right, and I noticed the faint gold bracelet on her wrist, one my husband used to joke about before we married. That's when my chest tightened. Something wasn't right. Our life, before this, had been ordinary in the best way possible. I had built a home with love, not just walls and furniture. The kitchen always smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. My mornings were punctuated by my son's sleepy voice calling for his breakfast, the rustle of his little socks against the cold tile. Evenings were quieter, but full, my husband in his armchair with his newspaper, the dog curled at our feet, and the faint hum of the heater as winter seeped through the windows. Life wasn't perfect, but it had rhythm and comfort and trust. That's why the subtle changes hit me like cracks in a dam. A forgotten phone call, a dinner delayed without reason, or the inexplicable tension in my husband's voice when I asked simple questions. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself stress at work, deadlines, nothing more. But the quiet unease grew heavy, pressing into every corner of our home. The dishes didn't sparkle the same when I washed them, the air felt heavier, and the dog's usual warmth at my feet seemed distant. I remember one evening in particular. The sun had dipped low, painting the kitchen walls a muted orange. I was chopping onions, the scent stinging my eyes, when I noticed his tie hanging crookedly over the chair back, as if it had been hastily discarded. My husband came in, brushing his hands on his slacks, smiling in that casual way that usually made me feel safe. But that night, it faltered. His eyes darted, lingered too long on something I couldn't see, and then he murmured, "I'll handle it later." I didn't push. I had learned, slowly, that pushing too soon only tightened the silence between us. And then, she appeared. Not by accident, not as a fleeting shadow of the past, but deliberate. She arrived in court, on papers we hadn't even expected to be contested yet, carrying herself with a confidence that was almost unbearable to watch. The clerk called her name, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of nod that says, "I know something you don't, and soon, everyone will know it too." I wanted to turn away, to shield myself from whatever storm was coming. But my feet rooted me to the spot. I watched her, every detail seared into my memory, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the table, the faint scent of her perfume that reminded me of jasmine and something older, something dangerous. That moment, standing there, I realized she believed she had already won. That she had taken everything. And I knew, with a quiet, simmering determination, that I wasn't finished yet. For weeks before that day, my life had been a quiet spiral of suspicion and denial. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, my mind weaving shadows into shapes that weren't really there. But there were signs, subtle and cruel, that I could no longer ignore. The first clue came when I found a stack of letters in the attic, yellowed at the edges, tucked into a box labeled taxes and wills. They weren't mine to open, yet something compelled me. Among mundane paperwork, there was one envelope, thick and heavy, sealed with an unfamiliar wax stamp. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside, the paper bore my father-in-law's handwriting, steady, precise, and I read words I could scarcely believe, a will, one I had never seen before, naming me as the primary beneficiary of his estate. I reread it, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced through every conversation, every holiday, every quiet moment in that old study. How could this have been kept from me? How could anyone try to rewrite a future my father-in-law had already decided for me? I tried to forget it, to tuck it away as a secret I wasn't ready to face. But the mistress, yes, that's what I began to call her in my own mind, appeared at every corner. Invitations to family gatherings, unexpected phone calls from lawyers, whispered remarks from distant relatives who seemed to think they could manipulate the truth. She wore charm like armor, and it was terrifying how easily people believed her. Even my husband seemed caught between loyalty and fear, unsure of which side to take, or perhaps trying to protect everyone from the coming fallout. One evening, I found myself standing at the window of our living room, watching the rain slide down the glass in slow rivulets. My son sat at the table, coloring quietly, oblivious to the storm inside me. I thought about the life I had built, the smell of baked cookies, the warmth of his tiny hand in mine, the comforting rhythm of my husband's breathing as he slept, and I knew I couldn't let her take it away. Not now, not ever. I began to pay attention to the small, almost imperceptible details. The way she lingered too long near the family portraits, the quiet intensity in her eyes when she mentioned my father-in-law, the careful selection of words that suggested she knew more than she let on. Every encounter left me exhausted, my mind spinning in tight, angry circles. I didn't want to fight. I wanted to understand. But understanding, I realized, would require courage I didn't feel I had. It was the Sunday before the first court hearing that the first real confrontation happened. My husband came home late, a storm cloud behind his usual calm demeanor. The sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor was heavier than usual, almost ominous, and I could smell the faint hint of cologne he never wore for me. I didn't speak immediately, waiting for him to explain, but he only sank into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. "She's trying to claim everything," he muttered, voice barely audible. "I don't know how she got the lawyers to take it so seriously." I took a deep breath, letting the smell of the evening rain drift through the open window into my lungs. "The will," I said quietly. "The one he wrote. I have it. I found it." His head jerked up, disbelief and fear mingling in his eyes. You have it?" "Yes," I whispered. "And if we're careful, if we show it at the right moment," my words trailed off. The storm outside mirrored the storm in my chest. I didn't yet know how the confrontation would unfold, or how much she would try to manipulate the truth before it came out. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, sharp, delicate, but real. That night, I lay awake listening to the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, thinking about justice and fairness, about loyalty and deceit. I realized how fragile trust could be, and how courage sometimes came in the form of quiet determination. I had the will. That was my weapon, and my salvation. The days leading up to the hearing were a strange blend of anxiety and meticulous preparation. I went about my mornings in the usual rhythm, making breakfast, packing my son's school bag, folding laundry, but underneath it all, every gesture, every sip of coffee, carried a quiet urgency. I would catch myself staring at the envelope with the will, tucked safely in my desk drawer, wondering if she had any idea it existed. Would she suspect? Would she try to bury it before it ever saw the light of day? My husband tried to act normal, but I noticed the little tells, the way he ran his hand over his hair more often, the way his footsteps echoed louder than usual in the hall. And the mistress, she was insidious in her composure. I saw her at the grocery store one afternoon, choosing fruits with exaggerated care, her smile thin and deliberate. When she saw me, she paused, just a fraction too long, like a cat sizing up its prey before deciding whether to pounce or retreat. That glance was enough to make my stomach twist. I began to watch the small patterns, the subtle manipulations. My aunt called one afternoon, cheerful as always, mentioning how she had just bumped into her at the market. Her words were casual, but my heart sank. How many people had already been charmed, how many whispers passed along, bending perception in the mistress's favor. I realized that winning this would not be about shouting the truth or exposing her publicly, it would be about timing, patience, and calm precision. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of rose and amber, I found myself in the study, tracing the inked words of the will with my fingertips. There was something grounding in it, the way my father-in-law's handwriting had the slight tilt of certainty, the careful spaces between lines. This was his voice, his intention, his legacy. And for the first time in weeks, I felt not just anger, but clarity. She could pretend all she wanted, charm all she wanted, but she couldn't erase what was written in his hand. The night before the court date, I overheard a conversation that made my pulse race. My husband, on the phone in the kitchen, spoke in hushed tones. She has the lawyers pushing it, but we have nothing yet, no documents, nothing she can't spin. I pressed my hand to the counter, tasting the faint bitterness of cold coffee, my mind calculating. If she thought we had nothing, she would be reckless, overconfident. That was my opening. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in muted tones, avoiding anything that would draw unnecessary attention. I packed the will in a secure folder, placed it in my handbag, and checked twice to make sure it hadn't slipped anywhere. Every step I took felt like walking on a tightrope. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors, the air thick with the quiet tension of whispered conversations. And then, there she was. The mistress. Sitting in the front row, perfectly poised, exuding calm authority as if the estate were already hers. I felt a surge of something I could not name, fear, yes, but also a strange, hardened resolve. My eyes locked with hers for a brief moment, and in that flicker, I understood everything. She thought she had one. She thought the years of manipulation and charm had secured her claim. She didn't know the truth was coming. The judge called the session to order, and for a moment everything froze, the low murmur of the room, the rustle of papers, the faint squeak of shoes on the polished floor. I felt my heart thump, the old rhythm of nervous anticipation. I clutched the folder in my lap, fingers tied around the edges, reminding myself that courage was not loud. Courage was steady, deliberate, unshakable. And then, in the quiet tension before words were spoken, I knew, this was my moment. The courtroom felt smaller as the minutes passed, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. I could hear every sound, the soft clicking of the judge's pen, the whisper of the air conditioner, even the shallow breaths of the people seated behind me. My hands were steady on the folder, but inside, everything trembled. Her lawyer stood first. A tall man with a polished smile and the kind of confidence that comes from believing the case is already won. He laid out his arguments with smooth, practiced authority, claiming she had been a long-standing companion, deeply trusted, a silent pillar in my father-in-law's life. With every word, my jaw tightened. My husband shifted beside me. His shoulder brushed mine, and for a moment, I felt the heaviness in him, guilt, confusion, helplessness. He had known her once, long before me, before we built our home and our family. But she didn't belong in this chapter. And yet here she was, rewriting everything. Then she rose to speak. Her voice surprised me. It wasn't harsh or sharp, it was soft, almost mournful, carefully crafted to slip into the cracks of people's sympathy. I was with him in his final months, she began, fingers curling around the edge of the table. He confided in me. He wanted me to be taken care of. She paused, lifting her eyes to the judge, letting the silence stretch just long enough to look sincere. He told me he was changing the will, for me. I felt something inside me twist, not because her words were true, but because she believed her performance was enough to erase the truth. Her lawyer placed a document before the court, a supposed updated will. The moment I saw it, my throat tightened. The signature, it looked like my father-in-law's, but the handwriting was off. Slanted. Rushed. Not the calm, measured strokes of the man who had always taken his time with his words. My husband leaned forward, whispering, "That's not his writing." "I know," I murmured. But she didn't falter. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, as if overwhelmed by grief. The cynicism in it hit me like ice. My palms grew cold. "Your Honor," her lawyer said, "we request immediate recognition of this will." The judge turned to our side. "Do you contest the validity?" My heart pounded in my chest. This was the moment. I could have spoken then, raised my hand, presented the real will, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear. It was strategy. I needed her to believe she had one, just a little longer, to let her expose every lie before I tore it apart. So I stayed silent. For now. The judge nodded and continued questioning. She answered smoothly, painting herself as the loyal confidant. Every lie she told seemed to embolden her. I watched her face shift, the soft grief melting into quiet triumph, like she was savoring victory. And then came the part that broke me. Her lawyer stepped forward with a final statement. My client was more than a companion. She was promised everything because she was the only one who truly cared for him at the end. The words landed heavily, echoing through the courtroom. My breath caught. The only one who cared? I remembered sitting by my father-in-law's hospital bed, holding his frail hand, bringing him soup he barely sipped, adjusting his pillows at 2 a.m., whispering stories just to help him sleep. I remembered his smile, small, tired, but filled with gratitude. He had squeezed my hand and said, "Your family. No matter what happens." And now she was claiming to be the one who mattered. A tightness spread through my chest, anger, grief, disbelief all tangled into one. My vision blurred for a moment, but I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. Slowly. Because I knew something she didn't. The truth was sitting quietly in my bag, waiting. And when the time came, her lies would crumble like dry leaves. The hearing paused for a short recess, and people spilled out of the courtroom in murmurs and small clusters. I stayed seated at first, letting the others pass. My heart was beating too loudly, I needed it to quiet before I moved. My husband touched my arm gently. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost fragile. "Yes," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. "I just need a minute." The mistress didn't leave immediately. She lingered near the judge's bench, talking to her lawyer with a barely contained smile. She kept glancing back at me, small, satisfied looks, like someone admiring a completed victory before it was officially declared. I stood finally and stepped out into the corridor, where the scent of old books and disinfectant mingled with the faint aroma of someone's cheap coffee. My steps were slow, measured. My mind replayed everything she'd said, every fabricated detail she'd woven so effortlessly into her narrative. I reached into my bag, feeling the envelope beneath my fingers. The weight of it grounded me. It reminded me of the truth. It reminded me that I wasn't here to fight with anger, I was here to restore dignity to a man who had trusted me when his world was slipping away. As I stood alone by the window, watching the weak sunlight stretch across the courthouse lawn, I heard her heels clicking toward me. Click. 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 She stopped beside me. Too close. Close enough that her perfume, jasmine and something sharper, brushed against my senses. "You're handling this very gracefully," she said softly, almost sweetly. I didn't turn. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, come now." Her voice dipped into something smug. "We both know why you're here. But it's brave, really, trying to hold on to something that was never meant to be yours." My fingers tightened around my handbag. "And you think it was meant for you?" I asked quietly. She chuckled, a low, amused sound. "He loved me. He told me things he didn't tell others. That man confided in me more than you could ever imagine." I finally turned then, meeting her gaze. Up close, I could see the calculation in her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening around the corners, the careful slope of her smile. She was testing me, gauging how far she could push before I broke. I didn't break. "Love doesn't need lies," I said softly. Something flickered in her expression, just for a second, annoyance? Fear? Perhaps both. But she quickly masked it. "You're out of your depth," she whispered. "I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment." My lawyer is confident. The judge seems sympathetic. "And you," she tilted her head slightly, "you have nothing." She walked away before I could respond, her heels echoing down the hall, each step like a drumbeat of arrogance. But she was wrong. I wasn't empty-handed. When we returned to the courtroom, I felt different. Not stronger, necessarily, but more centered. More ready. My husband exhaled when he saw me, relief washing over his features. The judge resumed the session. The mistress's lawyer began re-emphasizing his points, polishing every sentence with false sincerity. But then the judge raised a hand. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to ask one final time, are there any documents, testimonies, or evidence from the opposing side that have not yet been submitted?" My moment had arrived. Slowly, I rose to my feet. The courtroom turned quiet, a silence so complete it felt like the air itself held its breath. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, voice steady. "There is something." I reached into my bag. The mistress's head snapped toward me, her eyes widening, her composure cracking like thin glass. I placed the real will on the table. "This," I said softly, "belongs to the court." When the will touched the polished wood of the courtroom table, it felt as if the entire building exhaled. A ripple of whispering broke out among the spectators. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharpening behind his glasses. The mistress froze. Her lawyer, who had been mid-sentence, stopped abruptly. I saw the color drain from her face, a slow, creeping realization that the ground beneath her had shifted. The judge gestured for the clerk. "Please bring the document forward." My hands didn't shake as I handed it over. Maybe they should have. But months of quiet grief, silent strength, and patient endurance had carved something steady inside me. The truth was mine to give, and I wasn't afraid anymore. The clerk walked the will to the judge. He unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the pages. The room was so silent I could hear the faint rustle of paper, the distant hum of a ceiling fan, even my husband's shallow breath beside me. Then the judge spoke. "This handwriting," he traced a finger along the signature. "It matches previous verified documents from the deceased." A low murmur spread again. The mistress's lawyer stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, we were not informed of this document. We contest its validity. This could have been fabricated." The judge lifted his hand. "Mr. Rahim, calm yourself. This court will verify authenticity." He turned to me. "Where did you obtain this document?" I met his eyes. "It was found among my father-in-law's personal papers, in a box labeled with his legal documents. It was signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, their details are on the second page." My voice didn't waver. I spoke in that quiet, steady tone I had learned to use in hospitals, in late-night conversations, in moments where emotions were too fragile to be held carelessly. The judge nodded. "The signatures appear legitimate." He turned to the mistress. "Miss Saba, do you have any explanation for why this will was not presented earlier?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Her eyes darted between the judge, her lawyer, and the document, the real will, lying exposed on the table like a wound she could no longer hide. I wasn't aware of that version," she stammered. "He told me he updated it, recently." I believed him. The judge looked unimpressed. "The handwriting on the will you submitted does not match verified samples. And, more importantly, it appears rushed. Inconsistent. Potentially forged." Her lawyer intruded again, but this time his voice lacked the earlier confidence. "Your Honor, we request a postponement." "No," the judge said firmly. "This has gone far enough." He picked up the real will again, examining the thoughtful, deliberate strokes of my father-in-law's signature. A signature I knew as well as my own breathing. "This document," he said, "is the legally valid will. It will be honored by this court." The mistress gasped, a small, strangled sound she couldn't contain. Her hands trembled. She reached for her lawyer, who stepped back slightly, as though distancing himself from a sinking ship. Whispers filled the room, sharp, cutting, unmistakably judgmental. My husband closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over his features. I could feel his gratitude radiating toward me, though neither of us spoke. The mistress, however, was unraveling. "This isn't fair," she burst out, voice rising. "He promised me. He said I would be taken care of. You're all against me." "Enough," the judge said, not unkindly but firmly. "Promises made in private cannot override a legally signed will. If you were misled, it was not by this court." Her face twisted, a mixture of humiliation, fury, and fear. The mask she wore so effortlessly earlier now lay shattered at her feet. And for the first time, people in that courtroom truly saw her. Not the polished, sympathetic companion she pretended to be, but a woman who had gambled with lies, and lost. I didn't sleep that night. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skull like you're underwater. Every tick of the wall clock sounded louder than the one before it, like it was counting down to something I wasn't ready to face. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, the faint yellow glow from the streetlight bleeding through the curtains. My hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the memory of everything I'd just heard. The truth. The secrets. The betrayal hiding right beneath my roof. I kept replaying every detail, every word, every expression. Trying to make sense of it. Trying to understand where everything went wrong. But one thing kept circling back into my mind like a relentless storm. Tomorrow, everything changes. The morning felt wrong. When dawn finally arrived, the house felt different. You know when you walk into a room and instantly feel that someone was just arguing, even if you didn't hear a sound? That lingering tension in the air? That's what greeted me when I stepped into the living room. My son was at the table, staring at his untouched breakfast, his leg bouncing uncontrollably under the chair. He didn't notice me standing there. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who'd been fighting battles no one else could see. My wife wasn't around. Usually she'd be making tea by now, humming something under her breath. Today, nothing. It was too quiet. Too still. I walked closer. "Where's your mother?" He flinched. Actually flinched. Like the sound of my voice hit a bruise he'd been hiding. "She left early," he said without looking up. "Said she had something important to do." I studied him carefully. He wasn't telling me everything. A strange message. At 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. I opened it, and my breath froze. "If you want the truth, come alone. 5 p.m. Behind the old mill." Attached was a pinned location. I stared at the message longer than I should have. There was no name. No hint. No clue. But the instant I read it, my stomach sank with a heavy certainty. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting for me to reach this exact moment. And now, they wanted to talk. My son finally speaks. At noon, I found my son sitting alone in his room. The air smelled like stale worry. He looked up when I entered, eyes red, face pale, like he hadn't slept in days. "Dad, can we talk?" His voice cracked. My heart tightened. This wasn't my confident, stubborn, brave boy. This was someone drowning, silent, afraid, and desperately trying to surface. I sat beside him. "I'm listening." He took a shaky breath. "Dad. I know you heard something last night." The room felt like it was shrinking. He looked down at his hands, twisting them around each other. "I didn't want you to find out like that," he whispered. "I thought I could fix it before you knew." "Fix what?" I waited. Quiet. Still. Letting him gather whatever courage he had left. And then he told me. Piece by piece. Detail by detail. A confession he'd been carrying like a weight chained to his chest. By the time he finished, I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. Everything connected. Everything made sense. And everything was so much worse than I imagined. But the worst part wasn't the truth. It was the look in his eyes, begging me not to abandon him. "Dad. I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just didn't know who else to trust." My throat tightened. I put a hand on the back of his head, pulling him close. "I'm here," I said. "No matter what happens next. I'm here." Because sometimes being a parent means walking straight into the storm, even if you know it might break you. 5 p.m. was getting closer. The rest of the day passed like I was moving through fog. Every clock, every shadow, every passing minute reminded me of the meeting behind the old mill. Who sent the message? What did they want? Were they a threat or a warning? By 4:40 p.m., my hands were cold. My heartbeat felt heavier. I stood at the front door with my keys in my hand, forcing myself to breathe. Before I left, I checked on my son again. He was sitting quietly, but when he saw me, something in his eyes flickered with fear, hope, or maybe both. "Dad," he said softly. "Where are you going?" I hesitated. He noticed. Of course he did. "Is it about everything?" he asked. I nodded once. He swallowed hard. "Be careful." There was something chilling about the way he said it. The road to the mill. I drove in silence. No radio. No distractions. Just the sound of tires on broken asphalt. The old mill sat far from the main road, near a stretch of abandoned land where even the wind seemed to avoid passing through. As I got closer, the sun dipped low, bleeding orange across the horizon. Shadows stretched like fingers. The air felt colder. The place looked forgotten, rusty skeletons of machinery, cracked concrete, overgrown weeds. But one thing wasn't forgotten. Someone was waiting for me. At exactly 5:00 p.m. A figure stepped out from behind a rusted pillar. A silhouette. Still. Silent. Watching me. I didn't recognize their face at first. But when they finally spoke, my heart dropped into my stomach. Because the voice was familiar. Too familiar. A voice I never expected to hear in a place like this. A voice that shouldn't have known anything, but did. The final reveal begins. The figure stepped closer. And with a slow, deliberate breath, they said, "I know what your son told you." I froze. My blood ran cold. And then. "But you don't know the whole truth yet." The figure stepped into the dying light. And suddenly, everything inside me went still. Because I recognized them. Not a stranger. Not an outsider. Not some shadow from nowhere. It was someone who should have had no reason to be involved. Someone who had always stayed on the edges, never too close, never too far. Someone who had quietly watched our family for years without ever crossing a line. It was my son's best friend. The one who'd been at our house 1,000 times. The one who knew our routines. The one who used to call me uncle with easy, boyish innocence. But the expression on his face now. That innocence was gone. He looked older, harder. Eyes shadowed with knowledge no teenager should carry. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "You're here because you need to hear the truth. The whole truth." My heart started hammering. I held my breath, every instinct telling me to turn around, drive home, lock the doors. But I didn't. Because every part of my life had already begun to unravel. One more truth wouldn't break me, not yet. I stepped closer. "What truth?" I asked. He looked at me like he'd been waiting years for me to ask that. Uncle, he said quietly, your son told you what he did, but not what was done to him. The world tilted. What do you mean? He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. I should have told you earlier. I should have told you before it got this bad. But he made me promise. He said he'd handle it. He said you were dealing with enough already. I clenched my jaw. What was done to him? He swallowed hard. Everything he confessed, everything he blamed himself for, he wasn't the one who started it. My blood turned to ice. He was targeted. Manipulated. Cornered. By someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My voice cracked. By who? The boy's eyes hardened. By someone inside your own house. The wind stopped. Even the birds seemed to go silent. I whispered the only name that suddenly made horrible, terrifying sense. My wife. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The pieces began to lock into place. The strange behavior. The lies. The disappearing acts. The sudden tension. The fear in my son's eyes every time she entered a room. The way she always spoke for him. The way he flinched when voices were raised. The guilt he kept swallowing like poison. His confession that felt incomplete. His warning before I left the house. Every memory snapped together like the teeth of a trap finally closing. Why didn't he tell me? I whispered. His friend's voice broke. Because he thought you wouldn't believe him. That hit me like someone had driven a fist into my chest. My son, my own flesh and blood, thought I wouldn't believe him. What happened? I finally asked. He hesitated only a moment, then forced out the words he'd been carrying. She didn't hurt him physically. Not like that. She hurt him in a different way. My breath caught. She threatened him. Manipulated him. Blamed him for things he didn't do. Controlled where he went, who he talked to, what he told you. My knees weakened. She made him think everything going wrong in the house was his fault. She made him think he was the reason for your fights. She made him believe that if he told you anything, you'd choose her. I felt sick. Physically sick. This wasn't a twist. This was betrayal on a level I'd never seen coming. There's more, he said. Of course there was. Truth doesn't come in pieces. Once it starts bleeding out, it floods. I didn't say a word. Just nodded. He looked down, voice breaking. She recorded him. My heart stopped. Recorded him saying things she forced him to say. Things that made him look guilty. Things that'd ruin him if anyone heard them. Why? I whispered. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. Because she wanted leverage. Because she wanted control. Because she wanted to hurt you, through him. The ground seemed to tilt. This wasn't manipulation. This was war. And my son had been caught in the crossfire. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. She's meeting someone tonight. Someone who wants those recordings. My pulse spiked. Who? He stepped back. Pointed behind me. And for the first time since I arrived, I realized we weren't alone. There was another figure near the far edge of the mill, half hidden in the rusted metal and dying sunlight. Watching. Waiting. I turned fully, my breath turning sharp and cold. Because even from a distance, even in the fading light, I recognized the silhouette. Someone I trusted. Someone I never doubted. Someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than anything else so far. My throat tightened. The friend whispered behind me. That's the person she's been working with. The figure began walking toward me. Slow. Confident. Unhurried. Every step echoing like a countdown. And in that moment, I realized. This was never just about my son. It was about me. It had always been about me.